If we have a look at the enhanced input system, we have these different assets that work as our inputs. Those assets are then mapped to keys within our button mappings, but what if we want to figure out which buttons are mapped to a specific action in our blueprint code? Well, it's actually fairly easy to do that. So you can do this in any blueprint that you want. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make a blueprint function library specifically for this, so it's easy to figure this out from any place in your entire project. So we do blueprints, we make a blueprint function library right here, and we'll call this BPF for blueprint functions, and then input utils. If we open that up, it automatically makes a new function for us, and we'll say something like get keys from inputs action. And all this needs to take in is an input for, you guessed it, the input action that we're going to be checking. So we just take a type input action, object type object reference, and then we're going to output something as well in a moment, but for now we'll just leave the return node empty. First things first is we get the local player enhanced input local player subsystem. This is the subsystem that is responsible for everything to do with the local player's inputs, including the button mappings. So we can then query the keys mapped to a specific action. This is just a function that takes in an input action and returns an array of key structures. So we can fairly easily just return that, and now we have a function that's accessible from anywhere within the project that takes in an input action, just kind of puts it into this function and returns it a little bit more easily than this. But from there, obviously, you can do a whole bunch more stuff. Like, let's make a new function, is button mapped to action. And that's just going to, again, take in a input action, so input action. And it's also going to be taking in a key. And there we can just take in a key, which is a struct that's just going to represent any key on your keyboard or your controller. And it's going to be outputting a bool, and we'll just call that contains or something like that. And again, that'll just be a bool. Now, with this, we can use the function we just made, get input keys from action, and we can run that. It does need a world context sometimes. So that's just because the way the blueprint function libraries work, they don't exist within the world, and oftentimes you will need a world context to run certain functions. That shouldn't really be necessary for this specific one, but if you are a little nervous about the fact that we might not be given in the world context, obviously you can just make it give in the world context as an input parameter, or alternatively, because this is such a simple function, we can just kind of copy paste over this same stuff and get the array that way. And then all we need to do is we very simply need to just check, does this array contain the key that we're giving in? And that's going to be our output. Now, for both of these, we can actually make them pure, and that makes them into these little green nodes without execution pins. So for both of these, that kind of makes sense to do. And these types of functions can be useful in a bunch of different situations, but for the most part, where I find them to be useful is in places like UI. So if we go into a widget, inside your widget, you might be using onKeyDown, which gives you a value of the key that was just pressed. If we get the key from the key event, we can then very simply say button mapped to action, the one that we just made, and we just give it in the input action, which in this case can be literally any of these. And then it says, okay, so is this key that was just pressed part of the button mappings for the input action that we're looking for? If so, we can do one thing, or otherwise we can do something else. Alternatively, a thing that we could also do is going into our blueprints. Let's see, I think we have a couple of input actions here. If for any reason you want to know within the code for an input action what buttons are mapped to it for whatever reason, you could then use get keys from input action. So in this case, we would be looking at the combo attack. So we look at input action combo attack, and now we have an array with all the buttons that are mapped to it. So there isn't that much to this whole thing, but it's just knowing that that function exists and that you need to get the enhanced local player input subsystem. You can put those words in the right order yourself. In order to access that is a very important thing to know. And a very big thank you to all my Patreons. You can see them on screen right now. If you want to help support the channel or get any of the project files in any of my tutorials, there's a link down below to the Patreon page to support me, or alternatively as a YouTube member. My Cave Student tier supporters, Oiku, Earl, Monseville Erno, and my Cave Digger tier supporters, Mauricio Farias.